My name is Frank McHardy. At present I am employed as Director of Production for the Springbank group of distilling companies, that is Springbank Distillery and Glengyle Distillery. I have worked for quite a long time within the industry. I've actually worked for 50 years. March this year was my 50th year in production, totally in production, either working on the actual distilling floor or else managing distilleries. Since 1963. Well, a very brief history of the distilling industry in Campbeltown is that Campbeltown at one point used to be known as the whisky capital of the world, because at one time in Campbeltown there were 34 distilleries. Now there was a few reasons for that, and the main reason being the transport links from Campbeltown to the Scottish mainland, if you like, to the Glasgow area. Campbeltown is a deep water harbour which allowed ships to come in, bring in the raw materials for making the whisky, and then taking away the mature whisky to be bottled in the Glasgow area. There was also a massive supply of peat, which was used in the malting process and also for heating the stills. That was locally to Campbeltown as well. And of course the climate. I mean, a lot of rain here, so a good soft climate, so all put together, it really brought the industry to the state it was in the 1800s when there were 34 distilleries. The Mitchells were one of the main distilling families within Campbeltown. The Mitchell family, they founded Springbank Distillery, and it was first licensed in 1828. There was John and William, two brothers, who actually ran Springbank. Now, John and William, they worked well together, but unfortunately they were farmers as well. You see, a lot of the distillers were farmers as well as distillers, because obviously some of the spent grains, etc., produced at the actual distilleries could be fed to cattle, and also barley grown at the farms could be used in the distilleries. So they actually had an argument. The two brothers had a big argument at one time about sheep. Now, I don't know what the crux of the argument was, but they fell out about sheep. So William, he took the hump. He got annoyed with his brother for arguing about the sheep, and he upped and left Springbank. 1872, he started Glengyle Distillery, which is about probably 400 metres west of the site of Springbank Distillery, so it's a very close proximity. And the distillery actually worked right through until 1925. Now, 1925 is quite an interesting date as well, because remember we talked about there were 34 distilleries at one point in Campbeltown, known as the whisky capital of the world. Well, that was fine. Now, the Campbeltown distilleries were asked to make more and more spirit. So they did. They made more and more spirit, but unfortunately they started to take some shortcuts. And when they started to take shortcuts making the whisky, they made a very bad whisky. So Campbeltown started to fall out of favour. And then you had also the Speyside distilleries. They were up and coming because somebody decided they would build a railway all the way up Speyside, so distilleries could then be connected to the railway, to Aberdeen, etc., etc. So Campbeltown then fell out of favour. Distilleries started to close down, and as they closed down, they knocked the buildings down, so the majority of these distilleries actually disappeared. And we came to a point when there were basically only two distilleries left. We had Springbank and we had Glen Scotia left. Now, Glengyle closed in 1925, but the buildings remained because the buildings were always used for something else, for some other purpose. They were actually used at one point as a rifle range. The local rifle club took it over. Then it was a farmers' cooperative. Well, in the year 2000, the distillery was bought back by J&A Mitchell. We had a wander around Campbeltown one day, Mr. Wright, who's our chairman, Mr. Clapperton, Neil, who's our managing director, and myself, looking at all the properties that we own in Campbeltown, because J&A Mitchell do own quite a lot of properties. And walking past Glengyle, the buildings were in such good condition. Mr. Wright remarked on this fact that they were in such good condition, and that, yes, well, this used to be the old Glengyle distillery, he remarked, so why don't we actually get the place up and running again? Now, Mr. Wright had a reason for this, and one of the reasons was that in order to have a whisky distilling region, the actual region has to have 3 distilleries in it. And he turned around to me and he said, "Mr. McHardy, will you please put a distillery in there?" So I did. The design of Glengyle Distillery was actually down to Mr. Wright and myself. When Mr. Wright instructed me to go and source equipment, etc., to put into Glengyle, both he and I discussed what we actually wanted. And one of the main things we wanted in the production building was to have everything on the same level. So we had to think about that. We approached a company in Rothes, Forsyths, coppersmiths, and they did most of the actual drawing out, if you like, and the layout of the equipment as Mr. Wright and I saw it. Now, obviously Glengyle closed down in 1925, so there was absolutely no equipment left in the place, so we had to source equipment. Now, quite a lot of that equipment, probably about 60% of it, is brand new, but we did manage to source some older equipment, which we brought down and installed. One of the parts of the older equipment was the actual stills themselves. The stills, the condenser, the actual spirit safe, and the spirit receiver all came from an old distillery which closed down. Now, this old distillery was called Benwivis, and Benwivis Distillery was situated at Invergordon Distillery. And when I worked there in the 1960s, they actually constructed Benwivis Distillery, which hardly did a thing. It didn't work for any length of time at all. So the equipment, i.e. the stills, etc., were in very, very good condition. So we bought the whole contents of the still house and brought them down to be used at Glengyle. Now, we didn't actually use the stills exactly the way they came, because the stills were very angular, if you like. There were too many sharp edges to it, and the bodies of the stills were actually bolted to the necks, to the tops. So this meant that the spirit actually flowed all over the place. It didn't flow in a natural progression. Also, the line arm, the pipe which joins the top of the still to the condenser, we made sure that that sloped up slightly. This gave the effect that during the boiling process, vapour rising up to the line arm, some of that came back down into the pot. And this is a process called reflux. And that was important to us to produce this light spirit, because Mr. Wright and I both agreed that the actual spirit, the main part of the spirit coming from Glengyle, would be very light, lightly peated and light in character. Now, the mashing equipment itself is all brand new. We got Forsyth to supply us with a brand new semi-loiter tun. The washbacks themselves are made of a material called boatskin larch. Larch wood used to be used for making boats, hence the phrase boatskin larch. We insisted on having wooden washbacks because fermentations carried out within the wood will give a much more fruity flavour, if you like, again, when we come to the distillation process thereafter. So we insist on very long fermentations in wooden washbacks. The mill itself, another important part of the equipment, we managed to source a mill that didn't cost us 1 penny, the actual sourcing of it, which is great. You know, if you're a Scots person, to get it for nothing is brilliant. So the mill actually came from Kilkerran Distillery. They renewed their milling equipment, so when they threw out their old mill, nothing wrong with it, we got the mill, got it refurbished, and we got it in place. So most of the equipment is new, but there is this second-hand stuff as well. So the actual fitting out of the distillery took actually 4 years. You know, we spread out the process over 4 years. So we started in the year 2000 to kit it out, and it wasn't until 2004 that the distillery was ready to open. Now, the opening itself was quite a grand affair, and we invited various people down, including Winnie Ewing, who's a very famous Scottish nationalist MP. Now, Mr. Wright, obviously, chairman, was here, and Neil Clapperton, managing director, lots of people who were involved with the construction and also the kitting out, and people, friends of ours from the industry. We invited everybody we could to come along for the opening. Now, before the actual opening itself took place in the yard outside the main entrance to the distillery. And part of my job, if you like, I was detailed to do on that day, was to actually open a small curtain behind of which was a plaque. Now, so it came to the time when I had to do this. I was told, Mr. McHardy, will you please, Mr. Wright said, will you please go and pull the string and officially open the distillery, which I did. And then I got the shock of my life, because on this plaque it stated that this is the Frank McHardy production building. And I couldn't believe this. I almost fell in a heap. Almost very embarrassing, because I had the kilt and I'm a true Scotsman, you know, and I didn't want to fall in a heap, but never mind. The first distillation at Glengyle, once we got the distillery up and running, was a very important event. Mr. Wright again attended. We ran, obviously we did all the mashing and we did the fermentation, and then it came round to the distillation. Now the distillation, we all have a vague idea, considering the shape of the stills, the actual length of time we run the distillation for, the speed that we run the distillation. We'll have a vague idea of how the spirit should turn out. So we all stood about here and took samples of this distillation, and this took about 4 hours. And once this time had passed, we picked the best time when we should be collecting spirit. And that is very important. We found, we were absolutely pleasantly surprised. The spirit was very light, it was very fruity, it was very sweet, it was almost floral in character. So we were absolutely delighted, and we went out and celebrated afterwards, obviously. So after the first distillation had been completed, we decided that we would segregate most of this distillation into 6 special casks, if you like. So we approached Willie Taylor at Speyside Cooperage, and we sourced 6 butts. So we sourced actually a bourbon butt, 2 sherry butts, Madeira, rum and port. And we filled the actual spirit from this first distillation into these 6 casks. Now these 6 casks are then segregated from the rest of the production, put away in a traditional earth-floored warehouse, left to mature for 10 years, and they will be released as a limited set of bottles, 1 from each cask if you like. So your case will contain 6 bottles, 1 port, 1 Madeira, etc., etc. And this edition will be released in 2014.